Welcome to the Helpful Pharmacist weekly podcast, where we talk about all things health and I answer your guys' questions. My name is Chris. I'm the Helpful Pharmacist. And again, my passion here is educating people so they can live better lives. I think information is very powerful and it helps you understand what's going on and make the right decisions. Today, I'm definitely taking questions. So for anyone who's watching this live, feel free to message me a question and we can chat about that. That's what we're here for. I do have a presentation to go over as well. We are continuing in our diabetes education series. Diabetes is definitely one of the biggest topics on health right now, and that's going to be the way for the foreseeable future. It's basically an epidemic. It affects everybody, and it's something that is difficult to potentially fix, prevent, or understand, or all of the above. And so we're going to get into that today. The topic for today regarding diabetes is complications of diabetes. So again, this is what happens once you get it, where the negative aspects come from, and we've targeted the main complications or organ systems or tissues or things like that it affects. So we're going to go over that. It's going to be about a 30-minute talk here. And I also just want to clue before we get into it that the complications are generally going to be the same for type 1 and type 2. So either of those cases, it falls within it. And then also for anyone that's pre-diabetic, which is probably a lot of people out there that are watching this, that would also apply to them as well. So I want to give you guys some background here because I think the background is really what gets lost on people. So if you were to design a disease, I know it's a weird concept, but just stay with me here. Design a disease and the goal was to have the max possible amount of damage to the human body. Unfortunately, diabetes would fit a lot of those criteria. And I think that's something that's really important to be mindful of. And some of the examples, what I mean by that is that diabetes, it turns out, targets your blood vessels, it targets your nerves. Those are the two main things that diabetes is really impactful on. And unfortunately, your entire body uses both of those for basically everything. So there is literally nothing in your body, with almost no exceptions, that does not use blood vessels and nerves to do the majority of its business. And so we can kind of already begin to understand that if diabetes affects those two things, and everything in our body uses those two things, there's going to be a lot of impact. At the same time, I think it's intuitive that we all know what blood is. It transfers nutrients and pulls out waste. Obviously, that's very important. And the nerves basically are the communication network. So if we don't have nutrients, we can't take the waste or the trash out, and we can't communicate. We really don't have a lot going for us. And this is why diabetes is so impactful. And again, it affects almost every part of the body and almost every organ system, which also really makes it a problem. And because the body is designed to work together, things are not made to be in isolation. Your heart's not by itself, your kidney's not by itself, your brain's not by itself. They're all coming together, they're all working together. That is, again, why it accelerates the damage and it becomes such a problem. I also want to preface or start with the idea that some diseases have a simple concept and it makes it simple to understand. It's just one issue, it's one problem. So some really basic examples, and I'm kind of cherry picking these, would be high blood pressure. When you have high blood pressure, it's the pressure in your blood that's high. It's pretty easy to understand. It's very specific. If you have an infection, I have an infection in my toe, an infection in my ear, or infection in my throat, it's fairly intuitive to understand. I've got an infection in my ear, in my throat, so on and so forth. Diabetes doesn't really work like that. It's typically a lot of little things that happens all over the body and sometimes synergistically. And I think that's why it can overwhelm people, or they tend to ignore it because they don't have the background to understand how this one aspect or issue or concern. So I think my internet's not working too well today, guys. So I apologize. It just dropped out for a second. So again, we're just talking about how it's a little simple stuff that adds up with diabetes and people kind of sleep on that. I also want to include or mention the idea that diabetes is a disease of complications. Again, not a lot of diseases work like this. That's why people have a hard time understanding it. And the idea that I want to kind of get across today is it's a disease of complications. It's not so much the high blood sugar that itself is the issue. It's all the problems that blood sugar causes, the complications. At the same time, specifically, how it affects the blood vessels and the nervous system and the complications that arise from that. And that's where the issues come from. So I think that's another layer level as to why some people have a hard time understanding it. So it's that, whatever. Okay. So some of the examples of these complications are, it starts with the high level of sugar in the blood and where to go from there. So the first one that's the most important is it actually damages the blood vessels, more specifically the inside of the blood vessels. And again, it what's called the endothelial lining or the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, inside of the blood vessels. And that's where a lot happens because that's the surface that contacts with the blood, all the proteins, the immune system. Your blood vessels are very much like a freeway or a highway. Everything's going through them. And so you can imagine the lining of the vessel is important. It's kind of like the guardrails or the sides of the freeway. And if you've ever been driving and there's a giant couch stuck on the side of the freeway and you have to go around it, you can begin to understand how the edges of the freeway or the edges of the vessels can affect what goes through them, the path it takes, and so on. The other one that really impacts, like we already mentioned, are the nerves. So there's a lot of correlation between diabetes and nerve damage, diabetic complications in the nerves, and we're going to get into that. But some quick examples are there's about 100,000 amputations a year in the United States that are causing or due to diabetes. And the main reason why that's actually happening is the nerves. And the second one I want to mention that's nerve related is going to be blindness. Unfortunately, diabetes is the leading cause of blindness in the United States, and the nerves are a major role for that. Some of the other complications can be, again, the contents of the blood, in some cases platelets, which comes with stroke risk. It's also a cause for inflammation. It makes inflammation significantly worse, can damage the kidneys, and it's also a risk factor for cancers because cancers thrive off sugar in the blood, basically. And then just to kind of cap that off, I want to include the idea that for diabetic patients, when unfortunately they do eventually pass away or they die, 50% or more of those deaths, the actual cause of the death is related to cardiovascular disease. So my point here is that when you're a diabetic and you succumb, unfortunately, to diabetes, it's not the diabetes that gets you, it's the complications. And in this case, it's a cardiovascular disease. So I want to make sure everyone's aware of that. Again, if anyone's just joining now, we are talking about diabetes and the complications. Sorry about that. I'm just checking to see if anyone's joining. Okay, so why does this matter so much? Why are we here? Why are we talking about it? Diabetes is truly an epidemic. It's one of the most impactful health conditions in the United States and beyond. How about the United States today primarily? The reasons why I say this is right now, roughly 1 out of every 3 adult Americans is pre-diabetic, and roughly 1 out of every 8 to 10 adult diabetics is actually diabetic. So if you add up the people who are pre-diabetic and diabetic, you're looking at about 130 to 140 million people. There's also a study that shows that about 70% of the people that are pre-diabetic could potentially become diabetic. So that'd be 50 or 60 million people. And there's also another study that predicts that in 2050, so in about 25 years, there could be as many as 1 out of every 3 Americans is diabetic. So we could be looking at something like 100 million to 120 or 130 million diabetics in the United States. So it's a big problem. It's only getting worse. And it's not so clear how you fix it, prevent it, and treat it. And there's some subtleness to it. And so we're trying to educate people so they can understand that. So I think that's a really important thing. The other one to be mindful of is that a lot of times when you have diabetes, you're not aware of it. So there's 10 million plus Americans that are diabetic who don't know it. And a lot of them don't notice the symptoms of the diabetes or the symptoms of the problems. So unfortunately, by the time they become diagnosed, they've already been getting damage for years and years and years, and they can already have moderate or even severe damage in some cases to their organ tissues, again, their heart, their nerves, and their kidney primarily. So that's a really important concept, is that a lot of people have diabetes and don't know it. It's damaging their body. They're not aware of it because they can't really notice that level of damage yet. And by the time they finally get diagnosed, they already have moderate stage issues. Another good example, this is vision problems. Like I said, diabetes is the leading cause of blindness. Retinopathy or issues with the retina is one of the leading causes. And there's a lot of studies that show that by the time you are diabetic, at least 5 to 10%, if not more of those patients already have retinopathy or eye damage. So again, it's hard to prevent it when you don't know you have it. Some of the other examples are how these things work together. And so when you have a heart problem, it causes high blood pressure, which then hurts the kidney. And then when the kidney is not working properly, it hurts the heart again. So you have diabetes causes a heart issue, which causes a blood pressure issue, which causes a kidney issue, which then further causes a blood pressure issue, which then further causes a heart issue. So there's not a lot of diseases where it's so cyclical and interconnected. It's very unique. Another example is if you have nerve damage, it can weaken your muscles and your ability to walk and exercise, which unfortunately can cause you to gain weight or get depressed or both, which can then make your diabetes worse, which can then make the nerve damage even worser, which can then make it even harder to exercise and again creates this cycle. And then also the idea that if you have inflammation, which is again caused by diabetes, high blood sugar, it can cause body pain, fatigue, not feeling well, depression, anxiety, which can then make it harder to do those lifestyle modifications, which then makes the diabetes worse again. So I'm trying to illustrate that it's unique in how interconnected it is. And again, it's the complications that cause other complications that cause the health concerns. And I think that's why people have a hard time understanding it, is that it's unique in how it works like that. And that the takeaway from today is that a lot of this is preventable and treatable, but because people aren't going out there and getting their A1C tested enough, they're missing it. They're getting delayed in their treatment. Things are progressing much further than they need to be because they're not getting tested. And part of why the problem is so great is that people don't get tested. And when they eventually do, there's a lot of damage that's already been done. It's harder to fix. So I also want to go over the idea of what is a complication, just so that we're all clear on that, since that's the topic. The textbook definition is an unexpected problem or secondary condition that occurs. So some examples is that diabetes can cause a vision issue. That's a complication. Diabetes can cause a nerve issue. That's a complication. And diabetes can cause heart issues. That's a complication. So it's a secondary condition that arises due to something else. And the idea we're trying to communicate here, to repeat it, is that unless we fix the diabetes, oftentimes these issues get worse. So not only do we have diabetes and a heart issue, but if we can't fix the diabetes, the heart issue is going to get worse, which are going to affect other things like the diabetes and cause more issues. So this is why I'm trying to do the talk today, is that diabetes is a disease of complications. I think it's a little bit of a unique way of looking at it. And I think it's really going to help people better understand, why this is going on and why it's a problem. So again, if you're just joining us right now, if you're watching this live, we're talking about diabetes and the complications of diabetes. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the message chat here. I'll respond to them and give you some more specific or individualized information. So the number one complication of diabetes is heart disease, like I already mentioned. Just so we're aware, heart disease is the number one cause of death in the United States. And like I also mentioned, 50% or more of diabetic deaths are attributed to cardiovascular disease. So clearly they're very linked and related. We talked in the very beginning, a big part of this is the blood vessel lining becoming damaged, and that's due to the elevated sugar. So I just want to give some quick examples of, first of all, we're talking about how the blood vessels become damaged from elevated blood sugar. The first one is oxidative stress. So the high blood sugar causes the immune system to react differently, and it causes ROS, which is basically a fancy word for free radicals. So you have the radicals going around causing damage. You also have what's called AGE. Those are advanced glycosylated end products. So this is a really fancy word for a sugar or lipid that's been modified in an unhealthy way. So basically you have additional sugars added onto the carb molecules or the sugar molecules, or additional sugar molecules added onto the fat molecules, and it changes their structure, and that causes them to accumulate and get stuck and damage the blood vessels, which then recruits the immune system to try to fix it, which increases the inflammation and makes it worse. That's another cause. Also, inflammation in general, like we mentioned, recruits the immune system, like I just said. Some of the examples specifically are things like cytokines and interleukins, if you're familiar with those. A lot of autoimmune diseases and diseases like psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, they are due to interleukins or cytokines. So if you're familiar with that, there's a connection there. Too much cytokines is a bad thing, and cytokines for too long is a bad thing. So as inflammation causes this chronic cytokine or interleukin activation, which makes things worse. There's also an issue with the elevated blood sugar affecting the blood vessel's ability to make something called nitric oxide, which is an NO molecule. It's nitrogen and oxygen bound together. It exists everywhere in the body, and it's a cell signaling molecule. In this case, it helps relaxes the vessels, and that's important for them because they do stretch. It makes them more permeable for nutrients and gas exchange, and it keeps them healthy. And so when you have elevated blood sugar, it reduces the nitric oxide that can come out, and that affects the blood vessel's health in a negative way. Elevated blood sugar also increases the permeability of the blood vessels, but in a bad way, and they become leaky, and things can go in or out, which are not supposed to. So that again causes a flow issue, inflammation issue, things like that. The high blood sugar also reduces the body's ability to break down blood clots. It basically inhibits the process that occurs. Like we also mentioned with things like AGEs, that can increase the risk of plaques or things building up in the blood vessels. So we can see here that it not only increases the risk of, I don't want to say clogs, but basically things binding and getting stuck. it also reduces the body's ability to break those down. So now it's having dual or triple effect. And like we also already mentioned, the idea of leaky tight junctions between the cells. So again, that's a fancy word for saying the blood vessels become more permeable and things go in and out they're not supposed to, which I think we can all intuitively understand is not good. I try to use a lot of analogies because I think it makes it easier for people to understand it. When I think of the cardiovascular system, I think of it as like a series of freeways, and I think about like moving goods. So, an item is manufactured in Arizona and it gets shipped to New York, and it uses freeways to get there or railways to get there. The railway allows you to move things, whether it's nutrients, resources, people, whatever it may be. Your cardiovascular system, your blood vessels are the same thing. And so when we have all these damages to our cardiovascular system or our blood vessels or our blood vessel lining in this case, it impedes that freeway's ability to move nutrients, products, and waste. And that causes problems. So I try to think of some little analogies here. So maybe the idea that oxidative stress is kind of like a pothole. So you're driving along, you hit a pothole, you pop your tire, you got to stop, it causes a problem. That's because oxidative stress and other things can cause weak spots in the vessel lining, which acts as a damage and impairs the ability. The AGEs are like debris on the road because they get stuck, they get clogged. So imagine you're driving on the freeway and there's a couch and you got to swerve out of the way, you get in an accident. Kind of a little analogy example there. I'm going to say inflammation is kind of like rush hour, where the freeway is just too packed, it's jammed, there's people everywhere, they're doing whatever they're doing, they're not paying attention, things don't flow and work properly. Or also the idea of when they close a lane on the freeway and now everyone's backed up, they're trying to merge, and instead of going 70 or 80, you were going 25 miles an hour, we're not even moving. So inflammation can impede the flow. Again, with nitric oxide, it's similar where it reduces the body's ability to adapt. So the analogy here is like driving at night. It's harder to see what's happening. It delays your reaction time. You can't adapt to the conditions on the road. Nitric oxide plays a role similar to that. And I want to emphasize that your body needs 100% of your cardiovascular system to work. And when it doesn't work, almost everything's going to suffer. Because if you can't move nutrients, if you can't move resources, if you can't get rid of waste products, everything doesn't work correct. Because food, water, oxygen, they're essential. And to put them into human terms that we can understand, it's having clothing, a bathroom, a warm place to sleep, going in to see a doctor, getting help when you're not feeling well. The blood vessels and the circulatory system, that's what it does for the cells. And so when the circulation doesn't work properly, the cells lose all of those resources and they have issues or problems. That the blood flow is basically a lifeline for your body is a simpler way to put it. And when it gets damaged, everything begins to starve, go without, get sick, it can't repair, and it causes problems. So some stats to close on the cardiovascular section with is that for every 1% your A1C goes up, it increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by 30%, just to show a relationship there. A1C is typically somewhere between 5 and 15. The goal is to be under 6. Once it's a 6.5 to 7, you become diabetic. So if you went from 7 to 8, 30%, 8 to 9, 30%. If your A1C went from 7 to 9, it's potentially a 50% increase in cardiovascular disease, just to illustrate how closely related the two are. If you become type 1 diabetic, which is typically a higher risk factor for cardiovascular disease, it could potentially be a 10-fold increased risk of cardiovascular events. For type 2, it can be about a 30 to 40% increased risk. So again, a pretty big impact. Diabetes, as an example, will double the risk of a stroke, again, due to the blood pressure or the blood vessel damage, to kind of tie that in. And for anyone who's interested in understanding what their, one second, sorry, just getting a message here. I'm just checking it out. For anyone getting this information who wants to learn more about their risk, if you go to Google and you type in PCE risk calculator, it'll give you a risk score. It'll help you better understand your individual risk for getting cardiovascular disease. So I want to make sure everyone's aware of that. And then before we transition to the next one, just some basic information on how you can prevent this in terms of cardiovascular disease related diabetic issues. Absolutely go and get your A1C tested at least once a year. That is the official way to evaluate your blood sugar and your diabetes risk. It's a super simple, easy lab. Almost all insurances cover it. It takes 20 minutes once you're there if you make an appointment. And even if you have to pay cash, it's like $40, $50 the most once a year. It's the easiest way to know if you have diabetes, which allows you to do something. The next one is measuring your blood pressure. So typically at home, depending on your age, you want to measure it either 1 to 3 times a week. So for anyone that's like under 40, you can measure it once a month, just keep an eye on it. But really, if you're over 50, you should be measuring at least once a week. And if you have any known risk factors, conditions, or concerns, even 2 or 3 times a week is a better recommendation. Ideally, it should always be minimum under 140 over 90. That's the guideline goal. So anything over that is considered an issue. And ideally, 130 over 80 or less is where we want to be. Also want to maintain a BMI under 30, ideal under 25. So again, if you just Google BMI calculator, it's a really easy way to figure out what your BMI is and get an idea of where that's at. Quitting tobacco is a really important thing to prevent cardiovascular disease, especially for diabetics. Getting your cholesterol or LDL checked annually, and trying to do at least 20 to 30 minutes of exercise multiple days a week. Those are the best ways to prevent that from happening in terms of cardiovascular disease. And most of those will also prevent diabetes. The next concept we're going to talk about here for complications, again, today we're talking about complications of diabetes for anyone who just joined us, is nerve damage, like we already mentioned. And the idea here is that nerves play a role in just about anything and everything that has a really big impact on your body. Nerves are everywhere and they do a lot of things. So how that works is that when you have damage to your blood vessels, that affects the nerve's ability to get those nutrients and eventually causes them to not work. So there's microvascular damage. Those are the small blood vessels that feed the nutrients to the nerves, using that freeway analogy. And when those blood vessels don't work properly, the nerves basically starve to death. They get sick, they stop working properly, and they die off. And typically when the nerves die, they have a hard time regrowing and the communication is lost. So the analogy that I've always used is imagine a damaged electrical cord. So if you have a mouse and you cut the cord, the mouse doesn't work anymore. Or we've all had a frayed stereo cord or a frayed iPhone cord and the charger sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't work. That's how I think of nerve damage. And again, we can all understand that if you cut the cord, the power doesn't flow and the device stops working eventually. The reason why, again, this is so important is that the lifetime risk or prevalence of nerve damage for diabetics can exceed 50%. So it's a very prevalent issue once you have diabetes. And this also plays into things like foot ulcers or foot damage, which is one of the #1 reasons why amputations occur. And it's thought to believe that anywhere from 15 to 30% of all diabetics will also have some type of foot ulcer. So again, for most diabetics, nerve damage is a reality, and there's a lot of serious complications that occur from that because of that. Along the lines of the nerve damage, there's also studies that have shown that up to 40% of people with diabetes have some type of pain or chronic pain because of that nerve damage. So now we're talking about a pain that you actually feel you have to live with. And that 20% or more patients with diabetes, they basically state that they've had that pain for more than 6 months. So it's not like I hit my elbow and it hurts for a day or a week. We're talking about prolonged pain for months and years for a lot of these people, which I think we can all understand is not pleasant. Some of the symptoms of that are going to be things like tingling and burning, a general weakness or impaired muscle movement. So not being able to use your muscles as well. We kind of already explained that if the nerve becomes damaged, doesn't function properly, it's going to have an issue. And this can also increase the risk of things like foot ulcers, like we said, is the common cause for amputations. But also those weak muscles can increase the risk for falls or fractures. So we can understand that if we're unsteady, we have weak muscles, our muscles don't work well, the nerves are problematic, the muscles may not respond accordingly, which makes doing things like stairs, bending over, standing up more difficult, increase the risk of falls. Also typically results in a lot of drug therapy. So there's multiple drugs that can be used to treat those neuropathies, and some of those have side effects. So that causes what's called polypharmacy, where you end up on 3 or 4 medications just to treat your diabetic neuropathy or your nerve damage in this case, which has its own issues. And it can also potentially affect you from doing things like going to work. So if you have foot pain, chronic back pain, your foot's burning all the time, it's going to be hard to go to work for some people. If you have a manual labor job, it can be especially difficult. So that's another concern there. And there's also been a lot of links and studies that show that it can affect things like sleep. So that's also a big issue too, because imagine you're trying to sleep and you can't because you're in pain. It can also affect things like your emotional well-being. So obviously if you have chronic pain every day, you have weakness, you can't do the things you enjoy, things like depression, anxiety, lack of enjoyment in life, those all become realities. And that further feeds into why this is such a problem. And again, illustrates the idea that there's a lot of little things that happen that people maybe don't realize or harder to understand, because we went from elevated blood sugar to blood vessel damage, to nerve damage, to muscle weakness or muscle pain. And now we're talking about things like depression and anxiety. So there's like 5 or 6 or 7 layers in that concept there, which is how it works. But for a lot of people, it's not super intuitive. So again, with nerve damage, part of the reason why it's so bad or such a problem is that people delay getting treatment because the symptoms don't present for typically 3 to 5 years in a lot of cases, and they don't go and get treated until they have symptoms. They don't get their A1C done every year, so they don't understand that they are diabetic. These symptoms don't present, or they're hard to notice because we all have muscle weakness sometimes, we all have muscle pain sometimes. There's sometimes non-specific symptoms, easy to miss, and they don't get reported. And so that's a really big problem because it makes a bad situation even worse, because by the time you actually start to get treated, you have problems that would have been prevented otherwise. And a lot of those problems can't be reversed. So if you have a vision issue, a nerve damage issue, even a cardiovascular disease issue, you may not be able to reverse those once they occur. So it limits. So some of the, again, symptoms that can be missed here are burning or shocking like pain in your limbs, typically your feet, which can be worse at night. Increased sensitivity or response to pain. So if you just notice that you're very sensitive to pain when you have it, that's a potential risk factor. Also things like numbness, especially on your feet. And that's why people have issues with their feet when they're diabetic, is that they get a cut and they don't notice it. And the cut doesn't heal properly, it gets infected. By the time they do visually see it, it's too late and it's hard to treat. Also things like poor balance and weakness can be also associated with nerve damage from diabetes. And again, those are fairly non-specific. There's a lot of things I could think of that would also cause those, which is why getting your A1C done every year is really the best way to be mindful of this. Just some other important examples of nerve issues are going to be organs can be affected. So for example, people have issues with their GI, they may not digest properly, the food doesn't move through properly, and that can sometimes result in constipation. There's also, unfortunately, a pretty big problem with sexual dysfunction, both for men and women. For men, it can be things like ED, and women can have their own gynecological issues in that department as well. Again, because the nerves are damaged, and it's hard to have sexual, performance when the nerves don't work properly, because those nerves are typically what is necessary for those activities to be successful. There can also be issues with the bladder, because again, the nerves play a major role there, and specifically for women, that can be a major increased risk for UTIs, and also, like we said, eye issues. So just some other examples of nerve problems. And that ties us into the next complication we want to talk about, which is vision issues. So again, if you're watching this live and you just joined us, we're talking about the complication of diabetes. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the message below, and I'll respond to those in real time. We're going to talk about vision issues now. Again, we're kind of progressing here. We talked about cardiovascular disease, which causes nerve issues. And one of the main or most impactful nerve issues is our vision. As most people can kind of intuitively understand, there's a lot of nerves in the eyes, a lot of communication and signals and data going across those all required nerves. I do also want to include here that I personally think that vision is one of the most underappreciated senses. It's definitely something we take for granted for. And I think that's what's so sad about diabetes, is that it really impacts things that matter, like your vision. It's just a very tragic thing to, I imagine you would lose your eyesight or have impaired eyesight because of diabetes, which could have been prevented. That's a really sad situation that we don't want people to fall into, yet it definitely happens. Unfortunately, there are between 15 and 25,000 people a year that go blind in the United States due to diabetes. I'm sure that's underreported. And there's a statistic that by 2050, there could be 3.5 million people who are literally at risk of losing their eyesight due to diabetes, and another 16 million who are on their way. So we're talking about a period in the future where we could have millions and millions of Americans potentially losing their eyesight due to diabetes if they can't reverse it, just to give you an idea. How this happens primarily is it usually involves the optic nerve in the retina. So you have a very large nerve that runs in the back of your eye, and the whole inside of your eye is covered in nerves, which are very sensitive to high blood sugar. And when the high blood sugar damages the blood vessels, those damage the nerves. And when those nerves get damaged, it impacts the eye's ability to do its thing. So the kind of analogy I have here is, imagine dropping your camera or dropping your iPhone. It could potentially break it or cause damage. I'm thinking of really expensive cameras that are very fragile. Imagine dropping one of those, it's going to break. So you can imagine that when that elevated blood sugar comes in and it causes the microvascular damage to the nerves, it has a similar effect where it basically can break the camera or the lens. So the analogy I'm going to use, the main vision issue that diabetes is shown to cause is retinopathy, which is just a fancy word for pain in the retina. And this, again, is thought to occur due to leaky blood vessels, which we mentioned is a cause of cardiovascular complications, and also the abnormal growth of blood vessels in the retina. So again, the idea is that it's the vessels, the cardiovascular system, that's really driving a lot of this nerve damage, which in this example is taking place in the eye. So again, the idea, it is somewhat complicated, but it does result in the idea of elevated blood sugar, damaging the blood vessels, which damage the nerves, which then damage the tissues that they're responsible for. So we kind of talked about diabetic retinopathy, and the idea is that by the time you're diagnosed with diabetes, oftentimes you've had it for several years. At that point, you can already have retinopathy, which is why it's important to catch this in advance. Diabetes can also increase the risk of things like cataracts, glaucoma. It can cause other optic nerve issues in the eye, and also macular edema. So there's a lot of visual issues that diabetes can cause. And in terms of how to prevent this, the simple answer is do not delay. Get an A1C done every year, go to your eye doctor every year, pay the extra $30 for them to use the fancy machine so they can see the back of your eye, because what they're doing is looking at the macula, the optic nerve, and the retina to see if there's any issues or concerns. And it's really important. And also for people who do have diabetes or at risk for diabetes, getting an eye exam done, maybe even every 6 months to really stay on top of it's going to be important. The last major complication we're going to talk about here is kidney issues. So again, the kidney filters our body out. And when I was thinking about this, the thought that came to my mind is the kidney is the one organ you didn't know you loved until it's too late. I personally think the kidney is one of the most underappreciated organs in the body. And once you have a kidney problem, everything else has a problem, is my point here. So that's why you don't love it until you realize it's too late. It's a highly complex organ. It affects so many things in the body. It's very sensitive and it's very prone to breaking, especially when you have diabetic or cardiovascular issues, or unfortunately both, as we'll see here. So being diabetic increases the risk of kidney disease by a factor of 3 to 5. And studies have shown that something like 30% of type 1 diabetics will have a kidney issue in their lifetime, and something between 20 and 40% of those patients with type 2 diabetes will have a kidney issue in their lifetime. So there's a major population of diabetic patients with kidney issues. A lot of those patients are going to go on to get kidney failure, which is even worse. I don't say this lightly. So typically in end-stage kidney failure, you have to go on dialysis. People may or may not be aware of that, but they hook you up to a machine and they basically pull your blood out, filter it, and put it back into your body. Unfortunately, dialysis is not a good place to be. Right now, there's about 500,000 Americans on dialysis alone. And the reason why I say that is if you look up the data, unfortunately, once you're on dialysis, there's only a 50% survival rate for 5 years. So if you had 100 patients who went on dialysis today, in 5 years, half of them are not going to be alive. Just to kind of illustrate the seriousness of kidney disease and the idea that there's 500,000 Americans that are on dialysis right now, and a significant portion of them are there from diabetes. And in general, if you look at the overall population studies, about 1 out of every 7 adults in the United States has kidney disease, just to kind of give you an idea of how prevalent it can be and how much of a concern it is. Again, the kidney is one of the main organs in your body. It detoxifies your body. It pulls the waste products out, electrolytes, metabolites, harmful toxins. All of those have to go out through your kidney. When the kidney doesn't work properly, those things build up and nothing good happens from that. It also plays a major role in a lot of other endocrine function or hormone functions. So your bone health, your blood pressure, your metabolism, your red cell production, all of those have a major impact with the kidney. So there's a lot of things the kidney is involved with. And the idea here is to show, when the kidney goes, you have a problem, and to link that into diabetes as a complication. So right now, what the studies are showing is that for type 1 diabetic patients, if they do not get adequate treatment, 80% of those in 10 to 15 years will develop a kidney problem. And then furthermore, 50% of those patients will go into end-stage kidney disease within 10 years. So the idea is that for type 1 diabetics, an overwhelming majority of them will develop a kidney problem if not properly managed. And even furthermore, a significant percentage of those patients will end up on dialysis with end-stage kidney disease. So there's a major connection there and a major concern. For type 2 diabetes, in the absence of clinical interventions, which means you're basically not managing it properly, you're looking at something like 20 to 40% of those individuals developing early onset kidney disease, which again, if isn't treated properly, can develop into end-stage kidney disease. And that's expected to be about 20% of those patients will develop end-stage kidney disease. So again, 20 to 40% of type 2 diabetics develop a kidney problem, and 20% of those go into end-stage kidney disease. So 20% of 20% is 4%, I believe, if I'm doing my math correct. If we had 30 million people and 4% of them are on that, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And with the potential future data of 1 out of every 3 Americans becoming diabetic, we're probably talking about millions and millions of people on dialysis or with kidney problems, just to kind of illustrate the trends we're going here. I also want to make it clear that for a lot of this kidney disease, it's a permanent decrease that cannot really be recovered. So once you have this kidney damage, it's not very common to reverse it. So a lot of these issues are that way: the vision issues, the nerve issues, the cardiac issues, the kidney issues. A lot of these are permanent. And once you have that issue, you cannot really reverse it. Again, I also want to touch back here that the heart and the kidney are very related. So when you have a heart problem, you get a kidney problem. When you get a kidney problem, you get a heart problem. And then they just keep going, and it gets worse and worse and worse. It affects the metabolism. It affects the hormones. It affects the blood pressure. It affects the nerves. Again, they're all connected. And that's the whole point today, is that it's hard for people to understand diabetes because it's not a simple concept in the sense of high blood pressure is high blood pressure. Again, we have high blood sugar, cardiovascular disease, nerve damage, and then the tissues begin, or the organs begin to have their own problems, which oftentimes link back to other problems and make them worse. So regarding how you prevent kidney disease, you definitely want to go and get screened every 5 years after you become diabetic. They can do some simple labs where they basically collect a urine sample in a cup and they test it, and they can use that very accurately to measure where you're at and be very predictive of where you're going and make the decisions. The next common one is going to be cardiovascular disease. So high blood pressure is one of the leading causes of kidney damage. So again, going back to measuring your blood pressure at home a couple times a week, understanding the guideline goals, 140/90, and that you really want to be 130/80 or less. And if you're not, you need to go to the doctor and get treated to make that happen. And things like weight loss, exercise, diet, all that stuff can further help with that blood pressure. But again, emphasizing that cardiovascular disease and kidney disease are very related, so we have to treat both of those. And then just the idea that a lot of these things are modifiable, but if we're not being proactive, we're not going to catch them. So if we're not monitoring our A1C, not monitoring our blood pressure, not monitoring our BMI, not going to the doctor, the risk of this happening is going to be increased and it becomes progressive. There's also drugs out there that can help with this. So there's some blood pressure medications called ACE inhibitors, which really help the kidney out for diabetic patients. And there's a really new great class of medications called SGLT2s, things like Jardiance, which are revolutionary in how they help and protect the kidney for diabetics and cardiovascular disease patients. So there's some really important topics that now exist in terms of prevention. Also just making sure that we don't have elevated blood sugar, elevated blood pressure, we don't have high cholesterol, we don't have diabetes, obesity issues, smoking, and we're not putting toxins in our body that we could be avoiding. So again, I know it's a lot of information. I hope I broke it down in a way that simplified it for you and you can kind of connect the dots. I'm going to summarize here real quick just to tie it all together. These are going to be some of my own words here, but what came to mind here is that diabetes is truly a nasty or evil disease. And what I mean by that is it attacks the core parts of our body in a way that few diseases do. It attacks our cardiovascular system and our nervous system first and foremost. And everything in our body requires those, which means once those issues happen, a lot of other things become affected. And that's why it's so catastrophic. And that's also why it takes time for that damage to occur before the symptoms occur. That doesn't mean the underlying issue is not there. So we have the elevated blood sugar. It takes time to cause the damage. The damage has to happen in a few places typically before we have symptoms, which is why they're so far apart. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death for diabetics. So those are definitely linked. Diabetes is the leading cause of eye and vision issues, which is why we have to be mindful and go to the eye doctor once a year. It's also one of the leading causes of muscle issues, mobility issues, and ultimately amputation issues. We talked about earlier about how the nerve damage makes us not notice our feet have a cut, and that cut gets infected, doesn't heal very quickly, and can result in an ulcer, which if left untreated results in amputation. We also talked about how diabetes is the leading cause for kidney disease, or one of the leading causes, and how that can be a problem. We didn't mention it in this specific video here, but there's also evidence that shows that diabetes increases the risk for things like cancer, or certain types of cancers, and it also plays a major role in cognitive disease. So again, it really affects everything, and it's the complications that are the problem, but those complications are not technically diabetes, which puts this disconnect between people and what's going on and makes it harder to understand. So that was really the goal for today, to break that down, to kind of give you those individual steps, repeat them several times, and give you the ability to really understand how all those things link together. I'm just going to close here again with how to prevent it. The number one thing is you have to be proactive. What does that mean? Get your A1C tested at least once a year, if not twice a year. If an insurance only covers it once a year, you could pay cash for $40 or $50. There's definitely a lot of benefit there. Get your eye exam done yearly. Make sure your BMI is under 30 and ideally under 25. Get your cholesterol checked at least once a year and look at your LDL, which ideally would be under 130 or under 100, depending on your age and your background. Measure your blood pressure at home, either once a month for people under 40 or once a week for people over 40, and ideally get it to 130 over 80 or under. Again, understand these neuropathic symptoms like tingling, numbness, weakness, impacted gait, lack of sensation. Keep an eye out for those things, because a lot of times those things are what's going to cause you to go and get tested, or they're going to get missed and not be treated soon enough. So if you're mindful of those, that could help in that process of that treatment. And I also just want to mention here that the Dexcom continuous glucose monitors are another great option for people out there. Whether you're pre-diabetic, measuring that blood sugar is super important, and using a Dexcom CGM is one of the best ways to do that. And what's especially exciting is this week, actually yesterday, the Dexcom Stelo came out, which is an over-the-counter product. So you no longer need a prescription to get a continuous glucose meter, which is a crazy concept. We've been waiting for this for decades, literally decades. It's super easy. Just go to dexcomstelo.com and you can buy it from them directly for now. In a couple of months, you'll be able to buy them through the pharmacies, but right now it's directly through the website. The price is $100 a month for 2 sensors, or if you do subscribe and save, it's $90 a month and it's shipped to your house. I'm wearing one right now. It's just this little patch right here, if you can see that. It's super easy to put it on. You just measure the blood sugar on your phone, and it gives you that data. So besides getting an A1C, getting a continuous glucose meter is probably the best way to monitor your blood sugar. It replaces finger sticks. And whether you're diabetic on insulin, type 1 or type 2, 100%, all those patients need to have a CGM. And for patients that are pre-diabetic, getting this now over-the-counter product is really great to give you that additional information on what your blood sugar really looks like, what foods make it worse, how exercise affects it. It really gives you a life-changing understanding of your blood sugar. And for people like myself who are thankfully not pre-diabetic but are concerned about it, it also helps me understand how to prevent myself from becoming pre-diabetic, and also what foods and lifestyle modifications I can make. So thank you for following the video. Again, my name is Chris. I am a pharmacist and a biochemist. I am the Helpful Pharmacist. This concludes our weekly informational session. I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch and join. If you like the information, please subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions, you can put those in the comments below. I can also be reached by email. It's very simple. It's just welcome@yourpersonalpharmacy.net. If you're looking for any health coaching or supplements, we also have that on our website. We have an online store with all of our pharmacist curated supplements, a really great selection of wellness products to help those people who are healthy, want to stay healthy, and for people who have health issues to target some of those health issues and hopefully improve their health. Thank you for following, and I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.